Hi students, I'm on campus getting caught up. There may be a lag in the audio and the video, so I'm sorry about that. I know that can be a little bit annoying. I want to talk to you guys about reading responses and Dropbox or discussion board posts. I've got several things I want to give you guys feedback on. One, secondary sources. Make sure that if you're asked for library database sources that you are using the library database to find those sources. There's several types of secondary sources. If it says scholarly, that means it comes from an academic journal. It means usually that it's peer reviewed. It's not a web source, okay? Second thing, when you're looking for secondary sources, you want to find a source that's as close to your topic as possible. So if you want to analyze setting in the lottery, you should be looking for an article that talks about setting in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. You want to find a literary critic or a literary scholar who's already analyzed that, and then use their argument to help you back up your own. So you still need to provide your own analysis, but you're going to use that scholar to help you back up your argument. Make sure you're pulling quotes from that scholar that really give a clear picture of that literary critic's thesis. What is their argument? What's their main point? I'm sorry, my office phone is ringing. Just a moment, please. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so yeah, you want to make sure the quotes that you're pulling from your scholar really reflect their thesis, not just them quoting the story. You don't want a quote that's just sort of out of context or a random sort of piece of their analysis. You want quotes that really sum up their position, okay? What else? Oh, introduce your quotes. So when you are quoting these literary scholars, you want to make sure that you tell who they are. So rather than just dropping in a quote from them and then in parentheses putting their name and a page number, you want to say something like, according to literary critic Sam Jones, comma, and then quote them, right? Or paraphrase them. You might even say something like, in the article, blah, 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 Sam Jones notes that, and then quote. This just helps provide context and it makes your writing seem more credible and authoritative. Also, connect everything in your papers and your paragraphs back to your own analysis. So your goal is not just to summarize what your scholar is saying, but you want to show how that scholar is essentially agreeing with what you've already come up with. What you're doing is you're using an expert to lend credibility to your analysis. So think back to maybe Comp 1. When you learned about ethos, pathos, and logos, you are in your paper developing a logical argument about how the author uses setting or how the author uses symbolism, right? So you're developing logos, you're presenting an argument. But what makes you seem credible and authoritative? You're not a literary expert. You're not a literary scholar, but you can bring in a literary scholar and say, Sam Jones agrees. Sam Jones says this essentially in his analysis. So you're using that scholar to help you build your argument. Okay, literary element analysis versus summary. Make sure that you're actually zeroing in on literary elements. Okay, so summarizing the story doesn't tell me how the author uses symbolism, right? You might be summarizing the story in a way that you think communicates that, but you've got to actually use that language. Like, in this part of the story, this acts as a symbol for blank, right? Or if you are summarizing the story and you think you're talking about setting, you actually need to say, this author sets the story in a small town. This is significant because, right? And then explain the setting. You've got to use that literary vocabulary like setting, imagery, symbolism, character development, dialogue. You can't just tell what happens in the story. You've really got to zero in on how the author accomplishes something through these literary elements. Assume that your reader has a basic understanding of the story. You might provide 1 or 2 sentences of summary in the introduction to your essay, but your main job is to really analyze how the author is doing what he or she is doing, which brings me to your essay prompts. And I'm going to turn and actually pull those up really quick so that I can talk to you about them. I've given you a little bit of an extension on that essay because I want you to get this feedback first. Okay, so topic 1 is about relationships, and it says many of the stories in this unit focus on relationships between parents and children, between husbands and wives, members of a community. Write an essay that explains how character, setting, imagery, and or symbolism is used to develop a theme about relationships in 1 or 2 of the stories. Okay, and the second prompt is about journeys. So it's really it's kind of the same prompt. You are not just summarizing what the relationships are or what the journey is. You're not supposed to describe those relationships or just describe the journey. Your job is to say what message is being sent about relationships, what message is being sent about a journey, and how is the author doing that? Is the author communicating, and I'm just making this up, is the author communicating that parent-child relationships are complicated? If so, how? By using a setting that draws attention to that? By placing symbolic elements in the work that draw attention to that? So your job is not to summarize the story or just talk about relationships in the story or talk about a journey. It's really to examine very specifically 1 or 2 literary elements that really point us toward what the author's trying to say about a certain kind of relationship or a particular journey. Hopefully that makes sense. So more analysis of how, right? Looking more specifically at the literary elements themselves. So for example, pick out some of the symbols in the story, right? And don't just summarize, but say, okay, here's a symbol. This thing acts as a symbol for this, okay? That's important because it shows us blank about relationships. Or this symbol is important because it shows us that the journey is blank. So come up with what your author is trying to say about a particular relationship or journey, and then literary elements. Okay, so then how did these literary elements point us back to that relationship idea? How do these literary elements point us back to this journey idea? Hopefully that makes sense. For either prompt, relationships or journey, you can do 1 story, 2 stories, doesn't matter. You have to have, though, a secondary source in your paper. So everything I just said about secondary sources applies to the essay, all right? Last, I noticed that on this discussion board, not everybody replied to other people. So just remember that on your main discussions page at the very top, there are instructions that apply to every single discussion board. So you always have to reply to 2 people, always. For some reason, a lot of people just didn't reply this time. I don't know if you ran out of time or if you just thought, oh, I don't have to on this one, but that's something that applies on every single discussion board. So I think that is everything I want to tell you guys. I'm not really in the office this week for real. I'm really just catching up from spring break, so I can't promise that I'll be super available. But if you do have questions, you're welcome to shoot me an email. I'm definitely going to be here tomorrow working, so I'll get it. But the later you wait to contact me, I'm not positive that I'll get it by the time your essay is due. I wish you the best. Good luck.